In this exercise, we're going to take a look at accessories that are associated with more than one bone. So for this, ordinarily, when we make an accessory, it's associated with a single bone, or at least a single bone of the avatar. So for example, if we make a headband, that's linked to the head bone of the avatar. But if we want to make an accessory that uses or utilizes multiple bones, so if we did some armbands, for example, we would be using bicep left and bicep right, or bicep right and bicep left. We can't do this with ordinary accessory setups, so what we have to do instead is use the clothing tool and create a clothing item that's going to be used as an accessory. So we're essentially making an accessorized body part. So, as always, to do that we need to clear the scene. Let's get back to our defaults. So that's the default. Make sure nothing is selected. So by default that might be selected, the cube. So select none. And then access the toolkit. So view, sidebar. There's the sidebar. And there we have the tab, the toolkit tab. Click on that. We access the tools. And for this, as mentioned, we want to use the clothing tool. So click on that to expand. And then click on append clothing file. Click that. And it'll drop in the avatar. So we've got a selection of the male, female, or we can hide. So let's first drop in our meshes. So we're just going to make some simple armbands. So add mesh. Let's make some cylinders. So add mesh cylinder. That'll drop in at the avatar's feet. We can make some initial adjustments, add cylinder. So click the heading. Let's reduce this down to 8. That reduces the complexity of the mesh. Makes it a little bit more faceted. So we'll just use 8 for now. The size is okay. But what we want to do here is cap fill type. Click on the list. We want nothing, because we want this to be an empty cylinder. So n-gon, nothing. So n-gon is the default. So now we have our cylinder. So we've got some UVs generated as well by default. We can use these later perhaps. We might have to edit those. We'll see. So using our basic manipulation tools, so move, rotate, scale, universal that combines all of them. Just going to move this into position at the arm. So rotate. And we can rotate on a particular axis, click dragging on the colored loops. So let's just position that roughly. Then scale. So that's our scale, that's our rotate, let's move. So to shrink or rescale on all axes, click anywhere inside the white loop. That will scale on all 3 axes automatically. And then if we want to scale in a particular direction, in this case, because we've orientated or reorientated the mesh, what we want to do is, instead of scaling globally, so we can see the axes, they point in alignment to the scene's general grid. What we want to do is adjust this so that the scaling or any manipulation is relative to the object. So for that, we want to go into the orientation option, so transform orientation options, and we can select local or normal. Generally speaking, in object mode, local is fine, so we can see how the widget has reorientated itself relative to the object. So now we can scale in a specific direction to get our armbands. So let's just do some more adjustments. Scale uniformly. A little bit of fiddling, and that'll do for now. So that's one side. We can either repeat the process, so we would add mesh, another cylinder, or what we can do is duplicate this object. We can duplicate this and mirror it across the center line. So we get a duplicate appearing on the other side of the mesh. And a quick way of doing that is, first we need to set the pivot point, so the point across which the mirroring is going to occur. It's a center line, so we're going to set the cursor as that pivot point. So for that, we want to go into Pivot Point Options and set 3D Cursor. So Pivot Point Options, or Transform Pivot Point as it's called in the heading, 3D Cursor, and we should see, as a confirmation, the widget move down to the pivot point. And there it does. Let's switch the orientation back to global. So from local back to global. Then double check the position of the 3D cursor. So for that we want the sidebar and view, and then we have the 3D cursor location information. So double check that that's all 0, click type, click type, click type, and it is. Then all we need to do, select our mesh, object, duplicate objects. This will create a duplicate that's linked to the mouse, so we can press escape just to release it. And then next we want object, mirror, X global. Object, mirror, X global. And that flips it across to the other side. So just to repeat, object, duplicate objects. That duplicates the initial object that we've created. Then with the duplicate selected, object, mirror, X global. It could be Y global or Z global, depending on what it is that you're mirroring and where that is being mirrored to. So that is our two objects. So let's just do a bit of editing to these. We need to assign a material and just assign a texture. So first thing we want to do, select our objects, object, shade smooth. Just want to get rid of the faceting so that these look like uniform shapes. So make sure they are selected, object, shade smooth, do that to both of them. Shade smooth. We can see that the facets disappear, although we can still see them on the profile of our object. That's step one. Step 2, materials. Material properties. No material assigned to our objects, so we can either click on the plus button or click on the new button. The plus button creates an entry that's unpopulated. Clicking on new creates an entry and populates it with properties. So click on that, click, rename, square brackets 0, close square brackets, that's our IMVU compatible name. Give a preview, we can just change the base color for the moment. So for the second object we want this to use the same material, so select, and instead of creating an entry, we don't need to do that. We can select the same material from the browse list. And there it is, armband. This will assign the same material to this object. Armband, and there it is. So that's the basic material with all its basic properties. To complete it, we need to go into Shading Workspace. Shading Workspace. There is our avatar with our objects. We've got our basic material nodes. These are the defaults that always appear when we create a new material. To this, we want to add, so add texture and image texture. And this is what's going to actually appear on our mesh. Image texture. Click to drop that in place, and then click drag color to base color. So it'll go black because we don't have anything associated with this yet, so we're going to create a new image. So click the new button, new. Let's title this armband, so click type. We don't need the numerical append. Width, our maximum is 512 in any particular direction, so 512, and we might be able to get away with 256 for the height. 256. Generated type. Let's set that to color grid, and then OK. And there is our color grid associated with our armbands. What we need to do next is edit or adjust the UVs, because these are a bit squashed. We can do both of them at the same time because of Blender's multi-object editing feature. So for that, all we need to do is make sure both objects are selected. So shift click, switch to UV editing workspace, where the objects will be prepped and ready for editing, or pre-selected in edit mode. So they are set to edit mode by default. Let's enable material preview so we can see what we're doing. And we've got the UVs for both objects, so they're both selected. So select all, just in case they're not, or press the A key. That's a shortcut. And both of them occupy the entirety of our texture. And what we want to do is have both UV sections share this image. So we're going to have one on the bottom half and the other on the top half. And because this is a relatively simple shape, that's quite straightforward to do. So in the editor, we're going to switch to island selection. So this will allow us to select an entire UV island. So that is essentially a separate section of the UV. In this case, it's all one section. So it'll select the UVs associated with one armband. We'll find out which one it is in a second when we move it. So we've got our widgets, move, rotate, scale, universal, same as with other views. Enable move, get the widget appearing, and we're just going to move this off center so we can see that this UV that we have selected at the moment is associated with this armband. So what we can do, select both of them now, so that's shift click. We're going to use the scale tool and just rescale both of them. Click dragging the green handle of the widget, like so. We can hold the control key down to snap to increments, move, and we can pop them into place. So now we have which armband is which. So let's select, just press the G key. So that's that one. And obviously the one at the top is the other armband, but that one is backwards. So select it. So we're still in island selection. UV, mirror, and x-axes. This will flip the UV across that axis. And that's flipped it the right way around. So that is the basic UV setup So what we can do here before we move on to set up our object for export, because that's essentially it. With the toolkit, all we essentially need to do is mesh our object, make sure it has a material, and make sure that the UVs are correctly set up or mapped to an image that's associated with the material. Before we move on, what we want to do is, because we've created, this is a generated image, it won't export or import properly into Studio. So what we want to do is image, save as, and then find our file that we want to save to. Let's move this to the proper directory, avatar. Armband diffuse. We can change the format if we want, preferably a lossless, but PNG is okay for now. We can decrease or turn off, disable compression, click slide to 0, and then save as image. So this will essentially convert this data, this generated data, into a real image. It will make it real, which is now associated with our material. So when we export this, it'll export the texture, the meshes, and the setup, and import that correctly into Studio. So next step, layout. So this is where the toolkit comes into play. So click on the tab again so we expose the toolkit's tools. And we've got our armbands. We need to associate those with the skeleton. So click the armband and then click on Bind to Armature. So right now, if we take a look at the inner workings of the mesh itself, so these objects have nothing. So we're going to Object Data Properties. They have nothing associated with them. So there are no vertex groups, and there's no way for these objects to move when the skeleton moves, because there is literally no link or no association between them. So there's no vertex groups and there's no armature modifier. So when we bind to armature, this will create the necessary link between the skeleton and our object. So click on the button, bind to armature. Let's take a look at the object. So we now have an armature modifier that's automatically assigned, and we have all the vertex groups that are associated with the avatar. We don't necessarily need all of these, but we don't need to edit these too much. So repeat that for the other one. So click, bind to armature, and do the same thing. So select the mesh. There's all the vertex groups, and there is the armature. So now, if we select the skeleton, switch to pose mode. So we're switching from object mode to pose mode. Grab one of these bones and move it. So press the R key or G key. The object moves with the appropriate bone. There may be some tidying up that's needed, and we can do that switching back out of pose mode into object mode. Select our mesh. Let's just switch the pivot point. We need to make sure that's in median point, that's the default. So it now means that all manipulations are based on the selection that's being manipulated. So if we check this bone again, we can see that we've got some odd deformation of this one, but we haven't of this one. So that means there's multiple vertex groups associated with this mesh that need to be tidied up or removed. object mode. So select our mesh, object data properties, switch to edit mode, what we want to do is make sure nothing is selected, so select none. So we know that this bone is one of the bicep bones. So if we look through the list, the vertex groups list, there's RT bicep, but we want the left bicep, not the right one. So scroll through the list. We can expand this if we want. Click drag on this little grid here and we can expand the list. So we want left. There's left bicep. Highlight. Click on the button. Select. And it's not selecting anything. So we need to double check something. With the armature selected, going to go into Object Data Properties, Viewport Display, Name. Just enable the names so that we can see which bones we're supposed to be working with. So back on our mesh, what we can also do, select Skeleton, select the mesh, and then we can either manually switch to Weight Paint mode, or we can just click on the button in the toolkit, Weight Paints. Make sure just the mesh is selected when using this, otherwise it will throw out an error. So what we can do in Weight Paint mode is click on the vertex groups to see which ones are influencing our mesh, which shouldn't be. To make this easier, what we can do is switch to solid mode. So blue is no influence, any other colour is some influence, and we can see that elbow is influencing our mesh. It shouldn't be. So we can do one of two things. We can either highlight the entry in the list, change the weight to 0, so click drag and then paint on the mesh. So we're click dragging across the surface to paint out the influence this object has on our object. Or alternatively, we'll toggle out of weight paint or paint weight, so click on the button again. Alternatively, what we can do, select our object, edit mode, select a group, so we're on the left side, select, and that's selecting all the vertices that are linked to that group, and we don't want these, so what we next need to do is click on remove. Click on remove, select none, click on select again to check that we have actually removed that group. And we have, so let's repeat this. That's okay. So that's influencing. So remove, deselect, then click on select again to double check. That's okay. So clavicle, remove, none, select. So let's just double check that the spine bones aren't influencing that. And they're not. Although that one is. So remove. That's gone. That's okay. So what we should find now, toggle back into object mode, select the armature, toggle into pose mode, and move that bone. The wrong bones are no longer influencing that mesh, but the right bone isn't. So, object mode, edit mode, and this is LF bicep. So select. Now we do want to assign this to our object, so select all and click the assign button this time. We can then check this with select and deselect. So deselect, bicep is now influencing that mesh. So edit mode, pose mode, and we still have something influencing our object. So in these instances, what we can do, object mode, so select our object, edit mode, and here what we want to do is use the toolbar. Click on item, select a vertex, and we can see what groups are influencing our mesh, and these shouldn't be. And we can only do this to individual vertices. So we can see that LF hip and LF thigh are associated with this mesh, and they shouldn't be. So knowing that, we can do the same thing again as we did before. So we need to search through the vertex groups list for those two influences, LF hip, LF thigh. LF hip, select, remove. And we can see that it's dropped from the list that was shown. None. LF thigh, remove, and it's gone from the list. None. And let's just double check. LF bicep, select. So if we select any one of these vertices now, we should only see bicep with a weight value of 1.00 on all of these vertices. So this should mean that if we go back into pose mode on the skeleton, if we now move the bone, our armband moves as it should. So that's a little bit fiddly, but this is one of the consequences of using multiple meshes within a particular project. It can mess up or confuse the weight paint assignments. But once that's done, we are ready to export. So before we do, let's just double check. We need to check the orientation of our mesh. And for that, we want to go into Viewport Overlays and enable Face Orientation. And they are both facing the right way, which is good. But let's just double check. So what we want to do now, in the Object menu, we want Object, Apply, and Scale. Just Scale. That indicates that our object has been inverted, and that's a consequence of mirroring. Let's just double check our other mesh. Apply, Scale. That one's okay. So to fix this, edit mode, select all, and then from the mesh menu, we want normals flip. Normals flip. That will invert our mesh the right way around. So back into object mode. Let's disable or turn off face orientation. This is a useful tool for determining which way our meshes are pointing so they don't look inside out or backwards when they're imported into IMVU. So now with all of that done, let's save the project. Save as. We can't export unless the project is saved. Toolkit armband. Change the location. Save. So with that done, access the tools again. Select our meshes, so shift click, and then we can click on the export button. The toolkit will do its thing, and that's exported. We've got our confirmation message at the bottom here. That's all we needed to do. So a lot of the work is meshing, prepping, sorting out errors with the meshes themselves, and making sure that they're correctly associated with the armature so that they articulate when the avatar moves. So, with all of that done, import into Studio. So in IMVU Studio, we need to create our new project. So click the Create button or the plus button at the top there. And derive from, we use the male avatar, so we want the male empty clothing. So male clothing, all clothing. There's the male empty top. So select that. It'll give us a preview based on our avatar's appearance in the client, and then derive. So this is the base avatar defined by the settings in IMVU, and all we need to do now is import. So we're going to import the FBX. So import FBX, browse to the file, it will have prepended the word clothing to our file. So if we saved it as toolkit whatever, it won't be alphabetically down in the T's, it'll be in the C's under clothing. So select our mesh, and then click open. We'll get the importer and the preview of what's found in the file. Set up FBX. So we've got our cylinders, well, our armbands, and we're using custom mesh IDs because we don't want these to clash with the defaults. So let's change these to 10 and 11 to get away from the default assignments. So 67 and 61. Skeleton, we shouldn't need to change that. Scale, we don't need to do anything there, so that's okay. All we need to do now is next. There's our material. Next. No animation. Review. That's what it's bringing in. Import. So let's import our armbands, and hopefully they should be in place, which they are. So all we then need to do is go into component and change the material as we see fit. So we could replace this with something else. Let's use this one because it's the right sort of shape. Apply. Now we've changed our texture. And of course all we need to do then is go through the opacity, normal, shininess, emission if we want to. Obviously save the project. Modify your product's info, icons, title, anything else, and then submit to the catalog. That is a basic process of creating an accessory. So this is an accessory item based on body part mesh IDs. So we're using the clothing file instead of the accessory file or the accessory tool.